Matthew Kelly said, bad habits are easy to form, but hard to live with. Good habits are hard to form, but easy to live with. It's kind of the same way with hiring. Hiring a nice, incompetent person is easy to do. Firing a nice, incompetent person is really hard to do. So, keeping that in mind that you're going to pay the price somewhere down the road, it actually will make it harder.
This is Lead with Culture. I'm Kate Volman, and on this episode, we are digging into the hiring process, which is always a fun topic with leaders. And I am joined by Tony Ferraro, our Director of Coaching. Tony, this is like your favorite
I
topic.
love talking about this topic. There's so much to talk about. So, we're going to be disciplined ourselves here today and talking about just a couple things in the hiring process. But I'm excited, as always, to be on
As
and to
always.
be talking particularly about this subject.
Yeah, this is a good one. We work with so many leaders, and a lot of the leaders that we coach, hiring is a really big part of the conversation. And you're working with an organization now, and they're going through a lot. They're hiring a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to do this podcast because since this is such an interesting topic of conversation and we're kind of in the thick of it now with some of the people that we're working with, we wanted to be able to provide you with some good tools as you develop your hiring process. And so, Tony, that's what we're digging into today. So, what has been your experience working with so
Yeah,
many
so this is a
leaders?
great this particular project's great because I'm actually as opposed to move like kind of knee deep into the hiring process with the team, which is great. It allows me to test out a little bit of if what the things we're saying actually work. But, there are some nuances that I think it's just good to really get into an actual hiring process. The challenge is when you start talking about nuances or the round edges of things, it can lead people to think they really don't need to be as disciplined in their hiring as they should be. And that's exactly opposite of the message we want to give. So the first point today is that every organization needs to have a very disciplined hiring process. It is absolutely necessary to get the right people, to get the A players. And so if you do not have a disciplined hiring process, certainly listen to the podcast, but listen to it with the idea of I've got to get this process in place first. And then maybe when we hit that point, I'll understand some of the nuances that we're talking about. So the key is having a process, sticking to it. And one of the things that came out of being involved, and I'm very impressed with this organization because their process is really well defined. One characteristic of the process that I thought was really telling as far as, do they have their act together is so after all the interviews are done, which is maybe 4 interviews, candidate comes in, there's 4 or 5 separate interviews the candidate does that day. There's a debrief a few days later, and everybody that was involved in an interview. So that's the first point there. Oftentimes I'll hear that folks, only 1, maybe 2 people are involved in the interview process. I think you're really limiting yourself because number 1, it puts a lot of pressure on you to get it all right. And number 2, having different people hear things and ask different questions, those different viewpoints are really helpful in getting a whole picture of a candidate. But the part that was really fascinating was so on this debrief, you come together and the leader leading the debrief, the first thing they do is everybody votes all at once whether or not the candidate was a hell yes or a no. So there's no in between. It's like, well, I kind of liked him. Which, I've seen happen. Everybody gives around, and because the other thing that happens when you do that, your own opinion can get skewed by listening to other people. They're probably persuasive. When you do it up front of what you thought that binary decision, it forces you to go into that meeting really well prepared and have a thought out idea of that candidate. And not everybody's going to agree. I've been the only yes and I've been the only no. And sometimes, just getting a sense where there is some division in the group. Then the second part is you go through it and you talk about why. So it is a fascinating process, but the way that you are forced to listen in the interviews, knowing that you're going to be asked, is this person a hell yes or a no? I think changes the way you go through the interview.
Yeah, for sure. You're being held accountable,
Yep.
right? Like it's not just, oh yeah, I sat in the interview. Cause I've definitely been in organizations where you're part of the process, but it's not your decision. And ultimately it's not you that's going to decide. So you're kind of like, okay, yeah, they're good. But to know that you have to say the definite yes or no, and then why? I think it really just heightens how you have to go in there being a great listener
Yeah.
because you really have to listen to the candidate's responses so that you can accurately describe this is why I think they are the right person versus passively listening, which is, can tend to happen if we're all being pulled into a lot of meetings. And so if we don't think that our opinion is going to count in a certain way, it's easy to passively listen versus actively listen. And so this really allows everybody to take full ownership of their decision.
And I'm guilty of this. I've seen it happen also where the meeting's coming up, so you're not supposed to, but you have the little outside the meeting conversation. So how'd your interview go? And you're kind of searching for what other people are thinking so that you
I
don't.
want to get the right
Yeah, I
answer.
gotta read the room before I go in. So part of that, discipline process is everybody knows they can come in and give their honest opinion, which is really, really important. And the second part of that process is then you go around and you talk about why you voted the way you did. So if you're not doing that in your hiring process, I highly encourage that. Even if it's not the final decision on a person, number one, it makes everybody feel heard that's in the interview process, because to have people interview someone and then continually go against their recommendations or not even ask for their input, again, it's just going to drive down the engagement of your folks who are involved in the interview. So that's really impressive. That was the first part to do that.
Tony, how can a leader that's listening to this and they're thinking, okay, I might need to pull one or two more people? It depends on the company size, right? You might be a really small company. So who needs to be involved in the process? But then how can the person facilitating that hiring process open the floor so that people feel that they have the opportunity to be the one that says no when everyone else is saying yes and give that level of, trust in the table?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think number one, having a wide variety of interviews of folks where you're talking, whether it's about their prior career, whether you're getting really detailed on what they're going to be doing technically in the role, and then also the culture interview where you find out is this person going to fit into our organizational culture? When you just look at those three interviews, those can be three different groups of people. The last one's really interesting because we even recommend that for the culture interview, it not be people who are necessarily involved in the work that this candidate's going to be doing. Because it's really easy to get into the weeds of something technical. But if you take someone from a totally different department, their interview is over lunch, or they're going to talk to them in the culture interview about the characteristics, try to find out some things about the character traits of the person. You get a totally different view than you would if you're really focused on the technical part of the job that's in there. So what I mean by that is you can involve a lot of different people, even if they're not going to be intimately involved with the person working role. And I think that's a good thing. The second part to answer your question is that, now it's what do you do with that information that people give during the interview? It does have to be a space where people can really feel like they can give their honest opinion. And you have to be okay with that as a leader, that, if some members of your team are really thinking this person isn't up to the quality that you want, to be able to reject them, even if you felt like the interview went better with you, the being open to those ideas. So the proof is kind of in the pudding there, that if people are voting and you're overriding everything every time, then again, it's back to being a useless process. But for those people who are doing the interview, that's why a scorecard is so important. How do you come to a conclusion of whether or not the person is that person? My interview is really around, has the person demonstrated that they would be able to meet these standards on the scorecard? They would be able to do these things. That actually gets a lot easier then. It's either in their prior work, they've been able to do it, or they have something about them that demonstrates or has demonstrated that they can do the work. So having a clear scorecard, knowing that the leader is going to take the group's opinion seriously and being okay with that. So those are the ways to make sure that people feel good about the process and are taking it seriously. And then the other piece is a little bit of an intangible, but as people are going around, it's really hard in a group to say, well, I just really didn't feel like this person that, you're not going to be taken seriously. You have to have your facts. You have to have your reasons for saying that. And that's where scorecard comes in, to say there was nothing in this person's past that indicates that they would be able to do X. They haven't done it before. So why do we believe they'd be able to do it now? That gets away from feelings about people, because it is extremely easy to become enamored with people. And look, if you're doing your sourcing right, you're bringing in good people for interviews. So I found myself going through the interview and really liking the person. which is important. You should like the people that you're interviewing. Even if the person's great at their job and you don't like them, they have to be able to work for you. So that's a piece of it. But as much as I've done this, I found myself getting enamored with people by personality and maybe coming to the decision point and hearing some other people and go, maybe I was too quick to say yes on that person. They make a really good point. I didn't think about that. I got into the trenches with this person technically and didn't catch that they're extremely arrogant or whatever that might be, or they didn't listen to somebody else, whatever those characters that can cause some red flags.
Yeah, just because they like CrossFit, Tony, doesn't mean that you should just
Well, actually, you're
automatically.
in. That's the one that you're in.
I like this. I mean, that's really one of the biggest hiring mistakes that people make is I like the person. I just really like that. I know early on in my career, the first time I was in a hiring position where I was not taught how to hire, right? Unless you're in HR, we don't go through a whole journey of learning how to do this effectively. And that was the case for me working for a very small organization. And I remember I made a bad hire, and it was because I liked her. I was like, I like her. She's good. She's got good energy, positive vibes, and I think it'll be good to work with her. And it was not a great fit obviously. And she knew that because most people know when they aren't a good fit when they start working. But it was a really big learning lesson for me and for her, actually. So it's interesting.
Yeah, very good point. It reminds me of something that I think Matthew Kelly said that about habits, that bad habits are easy to form but hard to live with. Good habits are hard to form but easy to live with. It's kind of the same way with hiring. Hiring a nice, incompetent person is easy to do. Firing a nice, incompetent person is really hard to do. So, keeping that in mind that you're going to pay the price somewhere down the road, it actually will make it harder because you have that connection with the person. And you brought up HR, and what I'm seeing in really good processes is that the HR department facilitates the process, but isn't the leader in the process. They facilitate maybe the screening interviews to see who gets into the pipeline actually be on site and be interviewed. But after that, they're just facilitating, setting up the meetings. And then after everybody else in the organization's done the interview that was selected, then they help with that debrief. So they're not leading the hiring process in the HR area. And that seems to be real beneficial too. It's just, there's an ownership about people that are coming into the organization that everybody feels. So first part, have a disciplined hiring process and stick to it. Add that part of the debrief is so important to get everybody's opinions. And then when you have those opinions, then take them seriously. And if there's some reservations, then technically they should be a yes for everybody. However, leads me to the second point. And this is the nuance point. So I will say this again. Every time you talk about a nuance or a round edge or exception, people skip the first part and they skip the hard part. So the hard part is getting that disciplined hiring process. If you don't have that, don't listen to what I'm saying now, but do the first part first, or it won't make any sense. Now, there can be a time when you go through, you have a really disciplined process, but you find yourself the candidates aren't making it through the process. Some really good candidates, because you're very rigid on the scorecard and very rigid on listening for the right things with the person. All good stuff, but you have to ask yourself, what am I trying to do here? Am I trying to go through a process, or am I trying to get great people on my team? And that's the nuance part of that. And what I'm not saying is lowering your standards. What I'm saying is you have to evaluate, how is this going? And if we're not finding the right people, either we need to change the way we're sourcing, or maybe the scorecard's off, particularly the first couple of times around this. If you've got a scorecard and you're not finding people who can meet that, even though they're qualified in a lot of ways, then maybe you tweak that scorecard a little bit. And, I say this a lot. It's like the danger is letting the process become the product. And everybody feels great because they went through the interview and we have these standards and we didn't find anybody. Well, and be okay with that. You have to look at this and say, am I really attracting the right people? And then once we get them in the interview process, are the right people moving forward in the interview process? And there's two questions around that. I hear a lot of times from leaders that we're coaching and working with, and they implement the process and they'll say, I'm not sure I could have got hired here with this process. That's a great sign. I mean, it really is. It says that, okay, there's some real standards here that the company has. But I also think that statement itself says, you can look back and say, well, why were you hired? And
Don't say that. Don't call contention to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the other thing. I'm like, that's okay. We're saying it. I'm not sure I would broadcast that, but I did.
Maybe inside
Yeah,
voice, inside voice.
well, I did bring up the question. Somebody was really stuck on the process and the scorecard and one particular element of it. And I felt like I needed to ask the question. I said, are you happy with your team now? Yeah, I have a great team. Is everybody on that team at the same level as you're holding this new person to, or this potential new person coming? And if not, then it might be, well, okay, no, this person didn't have that experience, but we hired him anyway because of XYZ. So there can be some rough edges you need to round out that, you may have a scorecard where a person has to do these things, but maybe they're just coming out of college and they wouldn't have as much of an opportunity to have done those things. So you take that possibly into consideration. So I don't want to in any way to say lower your standards because human nature will do that. Particularly, you'll do it when you really need to fill the roles. When you get to two or three people and you turn them down and they weren't bad, it's amazing how when you have three no's that you don't pass through, that fourth person gets better by by nature of the other three people not making it through the process. Or I was in a situation where they had two interviews in one day, two completely different personalities. And the one person's personality, that was one where I was a no on one person, and yet I was opposite of everybody. And I really felt like the person's personality drew people to be swayed one way, totally different personalities. The one person had a personality that was different than the majority of the team that was currently in place. And so I think that had played a part in the person being a no. But as we talked that through, some people admitted that and realized, well, we do need a diverse personality. Diverse personalities can make for a great team. So being able in that process to have those discussions and allowing somebody to say, I wasn't no, but I've heard what people are saying. And I could be persuaded that this person could be a yes because I didn't think of that. Or, I didn't catch that. If you caught that strongly, I agree with you, then we shouldn't have this person here. So it's not the vote and that's it. There needs to be some conversation around that. There needs to be some real discernment. Are we asking the right questions? Do we have the right scorecard? Are we bringing in the right people? Again, not letting the process be the product, just having a great process. The goal is to hire great people, not to go through the process. And that's why, like in an HR department, I hear this sometimes from leaders is, an HR department can say, hey, we're doing our job. We're bringing these candidates through, so we're successful. No, if you're in HR, your job is to have great people working for the company. So not just going through the process. So that's a little nuance, but I think it's important because people can get real gung ho and they should, and very committed to a disciplined process. The point is you do something that's not helping you get the right people on board.
Yeah, and it's also makes me think of who's in the room. Having different personalities in the room with you that are making those decisions, and the person facilitating or leading the hiring process, it's important to be open to other people's feedback, just because I'm thinking if you have a perfectionist in the room who's thinking, nope, they don't check off all the box, and they're allowing the process to become the
Yep.
product versus, hey, we're here to get the best person that we can. And then you have some other people in the room that might be a little bit more lenient. So you can't go with the perfectionist who will hire no one. And you can't go with
Right.
the one person that might be too lenient and say, oh my gosh, we've been at this. We've interviewed 20 people and I'm done. The next one just gets it. So you have to have a nice balance,
Yep.
and everyone in the room needs to understand the process and the outcome. So I love that you said the goal is to get A players.
Right.
When we know that is the goal, we can be more
Yep.
flexible in how we get that.
Right. And the more people you involve in that process, the more everyone learns about that, and use your people as assets in these interviews. I know some leaders become overwhelmed because they're the only one doing the hiring. And yeah, that does become overwhelming. And you do become more susceptible to those mistakes we talk about in hiring, the emotional ones, the personality ones. And you can start, lowering your standards. I still remember going and getting ready to speak at a school. And, it is tough in a school. You typically need a teacher in every classroom there to start the year. So we're getting ready to talk to the faculty. See, you had some turnover, you have some new people. He said, yep, hire 7 new teachers. I'm not excited about any of them.
Oh my
But I
gosh.
needed to have somebody in a classroom in August. I'm like, oh, that's so sad. But, you know,
7? He did not like any of them?
But that can happen when you're the person doing the hiring. You've got to fill slots. Yeah, this is in all areas of life. We can talk ourselves into anything. You can talk yourself into that candidate.
Isn't that the truth? So what are your thoughts? Because I know an interesting conversation being had around, now among especially with candidates, is that they're frustrated with how many interviews they are required to go on at one organization. And they're like, "I've gone through, like, 10 interviews," and then they don't get the job, and so there's a lot of frustration there. So when we're thinking about a hiring process, is there a perfect number of how many interviews and what style interviews? Like, what does that look like? And that they can share those expectations with the candidate so they're very clear going into the process, "Hey, this is gonna be a three-part interview process. If you get through all steps, this is what you can
Yeah,
expect."
that's really a good point. I think that frustration can come when, an organization who's just sending folks to different people and they're all doing their own process. This person interviews this way, this person interviews that way, this way, and there's no collective goal. One person says no and they're out, and whatever that is, there's not a coming together. So there definitely can be too many, particularly when people have their own standards. If you have 10 interviews and 10 different sets of standards, the person doesn't have a chance at getting them all right. So that's probably where some of that frustration, I think, is coming from. As far as an ideal number, a rough way of looking at this is there's a screening interview. It's typically done by phone, and you're deciding, do we want to bring this person on site to interview or not? Once they're there, what we would call a career interview, where you're discussing what they've done in the past, and you're doing that to see, have they demonstrated that in something they've done, could they meet the standards of the scorecard? Another interview then is more of a technical interview, where then they're with people who are doing the job currently. And this is where they're asking questions that are more specific, again, to the scorecard. Have they demonstrated that they have the knowledge to do this and they have experience to do it? But that's, if you're hiring technical people, this is a great place for the career interview. The person can say, I've used Excel, this, and using the rounding function, and the person has no clue. Well, there's a big difference between opening Excel once and having actually, dug in and used it. So that's the
It's
place
on
where
my computer.
I've seen it. Put that down as you, as a skill set. So that's where you kind of separate at that part. And then a culture interview, where you're asking questions to try to find out, does the person meet the criteria from a character side of things? Would they fit into the culture? We'll talk about that in a second. And then what other folks do is, it's not technically an interview, but they go to lunch with somebody. And there's been some unique takes on that. Like, I forget the company, but they actually hired one Uber driver every time to take the person from the hotel to their campus and back. And then they bring that person into the interview process and they'd say, how did he or she treat you? And the person was the jerk to the Uber driver. Well, we don't want them there. And there's some iterations of that that are really interesting. There's, with some key executives, executive positions, I know a lot of them who say, this candidate has to have dinner with my husband or my wife, because my spouse has a great intuition and it's just another voice. But the first part talking about those, that's kind of a process. We're talking about 3 to 4 interviews max. And if you're doing it right, you should. Now they can take a while. Those technical interviews can be a couple hours if it's a real technical job, but that should be enough. I mean, when you get, as long as everybody is doing the same thing, has the same scorecard, is grading on the same scorecard, I think that's enough. And that's always going to vary by position too. But the last thing I just want to talk about was, what if there is a little division in terms of this committee, or, the folks coming in during the debrief? One way to not necessarily break a tie, but have further discussion, is to go to the characteristics of the person. And that's why when we're coaching organizations, we ask them to come up with, what are the 3 qualities that every person in your organization has to have? Now, people usually do one of 2 things. They come up with 0, they don't bother to do it, or they come up with 9.
Why would people not wanna come up with any? Why would it go from 0 to 9? Who wants to have none?
Well, for a couple reasons. One, there could be like, there's no agreement. Everybody has their own idea. So we just say, well, forget it. Or they think it's a waste of time. But if you go back and you look at your great people in your organization and have the conversations to distill it down to 3. Now, is 3 a magic number? Not really, except that it forces you, when you only get 3, what are the essential ones? Some things could be more important in an area. Some things are good to have, but they're not essential. I mean, what really are those 3 things? If you're a company where you change directions, flexibility may be a key characteristic of people. Hire somebody that's great at what they're doing, but they can't pivot. That's going to be a problem. at your organization. So what are those three most important? And then the other one is we've all been in these sessions where you put them on a big whiteboard or the poster board or whatever that is, and you end up with 12 of 13 or 9 of them. And then that's where people get stuck too. And I hear that all the time. Well, did you get your 3? We got 7. And then there's a point where we're splitting hairs, whatever that is. But trying to get to 3 just allows you then to say, look, this person may not have this, but they're really strong in this area. And I think we can teach them that. And it allows you to have that for those great candidates to at least have that discussion.
And if you're listening and you don't have your 3, we'll give you can start with these 3. Everyone that works at Floyd is committed, coachable, and aware. Committed, coachable. I feel like those are, if you're committed, coachable, and aware, I feel like you can learn the stuff. If you're coachable,
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to demonstrate you've done something or have the ability to meet the scorecards that we have. But if you got those things, you can do a whole lot with those 3. And like I said, I've been in a lot of trainings where we go through and everybody puts them up there, and then you got to get them down and what's the essential. And that can lead to some great conversations in the organization also. Think about all your people in a room that if you're a leader, ask that question. Maybe your expectations are totally different than the expectations that people have. And we know what happens with an expectation gap. It's going to get filled. So again, the first step is get a really disciplined process and stick to it, but then leave yourself the opening for great people based on, maybe some characteristics that they have. So because you're dealing with people, it's not a perfect process. And if you have the expectation that your hiring process is going to be perfect, then you're going to be disappointed every time. Because the other reality is you can go through a process, be very disciplined. The person does meet as much as you know about them, the requirements, and it just doesn't work out. Again, because there are people involved. But your odds of that not happening go up, exponentially when you have a process in there. So you can't let perfect get in the way of really good. And you have to be able to have some rough edges to allow a great candidate to go through. And the other thing is, and I'll say this is the last thing I'll say, is that another way to find out if your hiring process is good, unfortunately, is some of the mistakes you might make. So if you do go against some or there's a split recommendation and you bring the person on and you just find out it doesn't work, well, great that you learned something. Hopefully it's not too expensive. The process is trying to eliminate some really bad decisions in hiring, but every once in a while you'll get one where you're just torn and you move forth with the person and it doesn't work. And you can say, okay, I'm not doing this again because our history says this doesn't work, or it does work out. And you say, look, again, they're people. It's not perfect.
people are gonna
People are
people.
going to people. Yes. And if you're in HR, you know that the problem is very rarely with the R. It's always with the H. So it's not perfect, but start with a really disciplined process, and that will eliminate so many problems that you have. And of course, if you want to learn more about that, we help people all the time with that. And what's been great about this project I'm working on now is like you do want to test it in the real world. And I know it, I've seen it working. And so that's just great company wise that we're gaining that field knowledge to pass on to, I've been able to pass on to all our coaches. This does work.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are good points to talk about today, just because even in Matthew's book, The Culture Solution, principle number 4 is hire with rigorous discipline. And we know that when we're looking at, okay, give me the answers. How do we create this great culture? And we do get really rigid in well, this is the plan. This is what people said works. And there is a lot of room for it. There's different companies, different people, different ways that they've done things. And so to give yourself a little bit of grace as you work through that process is really important. So everyone has to figure those pieces out. But to your point, don't make the same mistake twice. Learn the lesson and move on. It's actually, when you were talking, it reminds me of in the dating world, right? Like how many people continue to date the same person over and over. I'm like, why do you think this is going to work out? It has.
I'm going to fix that one. I'm going to fix this one.
Right? Like, no. And so it puts leaders in a position of, okay, I have to be self-aware. Like, what am I doing? What's happening in this process and the things that I'm seeing and not seeing and doing? And I love the idea of also just allowing other people to be part of the process for a number of different reasons. Like the hiring process and what you've described today, it helps people not only with the hiring process, but in discernment and making better decisions in other areas of their lives and other areas of the work that they do. And so giving your people that opportunity does a couple things. One, it shows those people, hey, this person really values and trusts my opinion, and I appreciate that. And two, they're learning all of these new skills that they can take with them in continuing to help with the hiring and also in the role that they're in. So it's a win-win, win-win-win for all these people.
Default aggressive on your process and then tweak it from there. It's much harder to tighten up your process than it is to loosen up your process. So
Can't tighten up a process you don't have. So number one,
that's
get a
right.
process.
Your wisdom. Okay.
Oh, that's what I'm here for, Tony. That's what
Write that down.
Write that down. Oh my gosh. All right. Well, like Tony said, we coach leaders. This is what we do. We help the organizations build great cultures. And in order to build a great culture, you have to have good people because, people, it's all about those people. And there's lots of challenges when it comes to that in leadership. And so we want to support you in that. So if you are interested in chatting with us about what that might look like, and how we can support you not only in your hiring process, but in any of your people problems that we can help you with. We would love to be able to do that. So you can go to floydcoaching.com and someone from our team will reach out to you and have that conversation. Tony, as always, this was so great. Such a pleasure to have you on as a guest again, once again.
Love to be here. Absolutely love to be here. Love this topic too.
I know. Yeah. This is your jam
Yeah.
always. All
And
right.
we got a little
So,
dating advice in there too. That's a
hey,
bonus. A bonus.
bonus for all.
Got to get tagged so people are searching.
Oh my god, that's a whole other kind of coaching, dating coaching. No, we don't need to go there. All right, this is what happens. You guys, so those that are listening, thank you so much for listening. We so appreciate you, and we hope you found some value from this episode. And as always, we want to make sure that you're doing something with this information. So this is your opportunity now to go back to your team, whether your HR team or whoever does the hiring in your world, and really take a look at, do you have that scorecard down, and what does your process look like, and where can you tighten it up? So go do that, and then we'd love to hear how we can support you. All right, you guys are awesome. Thank you for listening, and until next time, lead with culture.